A cartoon that has been on television since 1989 has correctly named a Nobel Prize winner, described a $52 billion corporate merger 19 years before it happened, and predicted a specific Olympic gold medal result down to the exact country that finished second. None of those were the point of the episodes they appeared in. Every single one was furniture, background detail, throwaway gags, props that lasted less than a second on screen before the show moved on to something else. That is the thing most people miss. The Simpsons was not trying to see the future. The show was trying to be accurate about the present, and the present kept becoming the future. 10 predictions. 10 verified cases across 35 years of television. Some took 1 year to come true. One took 28. Every one of them was hiding in plain sight inside an episode about something completely different. Welcome to Yellow Fan. If this is your first time here, subscribing is free. Now, let us get started. The president nobody believed in. By the time season 11 of The Simpsons arrived in the spring of 2000, the show had already been on television for over a decade. It had collected Emmy Awards. It had launched careers. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie had become as familiar as any characters in the history of American entertainment. Faces that entire generations had grown up looking at on Thursday nights, then Sunday nights, depending on the decade. The show had survived long enough to watch the world change around it several times over. The internet had arrived. Cable television had exploded. The conversation about what counted as quality television was shifting in ways nobody had fully mapped yet. And somewhere inside a writer's room full of people who had spent years watching American culture with a sharp and slightly exhausted eye, one of them had a very simple idea. What if Bart could see the future? The setup was clean. A resort manager uses a magic trick to show Bart a glimpse of his life 30 years from now. What Bart finds there is not encouraging. He is broke. He is sleeping on a couch. He is a grown man in his 40s with no real plan, drifting through the shadow of a sister who became exactly who she was always going to become. The episode, called Bart to the Future, is about the consequences of coasting, about what a life looks like when someone never figures out what they actually want from it. Lisa, in that future, is the President of the United States. That part on its own was not the detail that would eventually make international headlines. The headline came from a single line buried inside a cabinet meeting scene. Lisa is going through a list of problems that have been handed to her by whoever came before. She looks tired in the specific way a capable person looks tired when they have been cleaning up somebody else's mess. She talks about the budget. She explains where the trouble started. And, in a sentence that the writers treated as nothing more than flavor, a piece of background scenery, she names the president who left her in this situation. That president was Donald Trump. The episode aired on March 19, 2000. Donald Trump had not yet hosted a single episode of The Apprentice. He had not yet become a fixture of reality television. He was a real estate developer from New York who had attached his name to hotels and casinos and golf courses, a man who had filed for corporate bankruptcy multiple times and still somehow managed to stay famous, mostly through a combination of loud opinions and a talent for staying in newspapers. A few months before the episode aired, he had briefly explored running for president as a candidate for the Reform Party, a third-party bid that lasted a few months, generated some coverage, and then quietly dissolved. Nobody treated it as a serious political moment. The press covered it largely as a stunt. The writers of The Simpsons processed it as a joke about where celebrity culture was already heading, filed it inside an episode about something else entirely, and moved on. 16 years later, Donald Trump became the 45th president of the United States, and a television comedy from the year 2000 had said so first. The episode itself is not structured as a political statement. Bart to the Future is a character episode. It is about Bart, about the specific sadness of watching someone waste their potential, about the gap between who a person could be and who they actually become when they stop paying attention. The Trump reference exists in the background of a story about something else. That is important to understand. The writers were not trying to make a prophecy. They were trying to make a joke about what a budget crisis in an absurd future America might look like. And in reaching for the most recognizable version of someone whose presence in politics felt comically impossible in the year 2000, they landed on Donald Trump. Dan Greeny, who wrote the episode, explained it clearly after 2016. He said the joke was meant as a warning, a picture of where a certain kind of cultural logic might eventually lead. A society so comfortable with celebrity, so used to entertainment as a frame for everything, including government, that one day the line between the two would disappear entirely. Trump in that context was not a real threat. He was the logical endpoint of a satirical argument, placed far enough in the fictional future that the absurdity would read as comedy. The gap between the warning and the reality closing was the thing nobody expected. The scene itself is short. It is not treated as a climax. Lisa speaks. She references Trump. The camera does not push in. There is no pause. The scene moves on to the next problem on her list. The line is positioned as set dressing, a way of making the future feel textured and specific without asking the audience to think too hard about any single detail. That decision, to make the reference small, is the thing that makes the prediction so striking when watched after 2016. A writer who thought they were making a real prediction would have lingered on it. They would have built something around it, given it a beat, made sure the audience registered it as significant. The Simpsons writers did the opposite. They made the Trump presidency something a cartoon president mentions in passing while dealing with more pressing concerns. And the casualness of that choice is what turned it into a document rather than a joke. When the clips circulated after the election, what spread was not just the name, it was the tone, the easy, almost bored way in which the line was delivered, the sense that this information was being conveyed to people who were already tired of dealing with its consequences. That specific quality, not shock but exhaustion, was the detail that landed hardest for the people who shared it millions of times in the weeks after November 2016. The episode has layers that most coverage missed. Taken as a whole, Bart to the Future is about what coasting costs a person. Bart spends the episode watching a future version of himself who never did the work, a grown man with no real achievements, living off the generosity of a sister who took everything seriously and built something real. The Trump detail is not random. It fits the episode's argument. The background of Lisa's future America is one where the serious work was not done, where a boorish, loud, financially reckless figure ended up in the highest office, leaving fiscal carnage behind, and now a more disciplined person has to come in and repair the damage. The background detail and the foreground story are telling the same story. Most people who shared the clip in 2016 were focusing on the name and missing the structure underneath it. There is another detail in the same episode that got far less attention. In the scene where Lisa references Trump, she is wearing a purple pantsuit and white pearl necklace. In January 2021, Kamala Harris wore a purple coat and pearl necklace to the presidential inauguration as the first female vice president of the United States. Mike Scully, who was executive producer at the time, later said the purple was a random choice made by the animation team, and that Lisa has always worn pearls as part of her standard look. The writers were not thinking about Kamala Harris in the year 2000. They could not have been. The detail exists entirely by accident, and yet it is there. A woman in a position of national significance, dressed in purple, wearing pearls, navigating the aftermath of a Trump administration. The episode placed that image in the world in March 2000, and 21 years later, the world walked into it. In 2000, none of this registered as significant. The episode aired, got reasonable reviews, and moved on. The Simpsons was cranking out 22 episodes a season at that point. The Trump line was one of thousands of jokes those writers produced that year. The show had been on the air long enough and observed American culture closely enough that certain things that looked like predictions were really just the logical conclusions of patterns the writers had been watching develop for years. Reagan had been a movie star. Schwarzenegger would be governor of California in 3 years. The path from entertainment to political office was not invisible in 2000. The Simpsons just named a specific person at the end of it. What changed in the 16 years between the episode and the election was the speed and intensity of the cultural forces the writers were already describing. Celebrity culture did not moderate after 2000. Social media arrived and accelerated everything. Reality television became the dominant entertainment format of the decade. The line between a famous person and a credible public figure continued to blur in exactly the direction the episode was gesturing at. By 2016, the conditions the show had treated as an absurd hypothetical had become simply the conditions. The joke did not change, the world changed to match it. After November 2016, the Simpsons writers used their first new episode to respond. The chalkboard gag, the cold open tradition where Bart writes something on the blackboard as punishment, read, "Being right sucks." Executive producer Al Jean acknowledged the prediction in multiple interviews. The show did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. The warning had been issued in the form of a joke 16 years earlier, and the warning had come true. And the response from the people who wrote the warning was a kind of flat, exhausted resignation that the episode had somehow captured in Lisa's posture back in the year 2000. The Trump prediction is the most famous case in the entire canon of Simpsons predictions, for reasons that have as much to do with cultural timing as with accuracy. Other cases in this essay are more specific. One involves a named economist appearing on a prop piece of paper in a single frame of animation, identified as the winner of a specific prize 6 years before he won it. That case is arguably more impressive as a pure act of accidental precision. But the Trump case is the one that made millions of people stop and ask the same question at the same time. How does a television comedy say something 16 years before it happens? The answer the show's writers have given consistently is volume and observation. Hundreds of episodes, thousands of jokes, an enormous amount of time spent watching how America works, where its contradictions are, what its least examined assumptions might eventually produce. Eventually, some percentage of those jokes lines up with what actually happens. That answer is honest, and it is probably the most accurate one available. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a corporation that swallowed another corporation for $52 billion, and a sign on a building that had already named the deal 19 years before a Section 2. The sign on the building: Homer Simpson does not belong in Hollywood. That is the premise of When You Dish Upon a Star, the 5th episode of Season 10, which first aired on November 8, 1998. The episode works because it takes that basic truth, Homer is the wrong person in the wrong place, and stretches it across the specific absurdity of celebrity culture at the end of the 1990s. Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger have moved to Springfield to escape the pressure of fame. They want a normal life. They want privacy. They want to exist without cameras and opinions and the relentless machinery of public attention that comes with being two of the most recognizable people in the world. What they get instead is Homer. He crashes into their lives literally, parasailing off course and landing in their bedroom, and then refuses to leave in the way that only Homer can, which is to say through a combination of total obliviousness and genuine warmth. He becomes their assistant. He runs errands. He drives them around. He treats the whole arrangement as perfectly natural, because Homer treats most things as perfectly natural, which is one of his more endearing qualities and also one of his most catastrophic ones. The episode is mostly a showcase for celebrity cameos done in the specific Simpsons style, which means the famous people are not flattered. Baldwin and Basinger are not playing themselves. They are playing a version of themselves that the show treats as gently absurd. Ron Howard shows up as well, and his role in the episode is where everything eventually lands. Near the end of the episode, Howard takes a script idea, one that Homer had pitched and that Howard had quietly absorbed and claimed as his own, into the offices of 20th Century Fox to sell it. He walks into the building. The camera shows the exterior. And on the wall of the building, below the main signage of the studio lot, there is a smaller line of text. It reads, "A division of Walt Disney Company." The gag lasts less than a second. It is a background detail. There is no close-up. No character points at it. No one in the scene comments on it. The camera is not trying to make the audience notice it. It is the kind of visual joke the Simpsons writers were famous for. Something placed in the frame for the fraction of the audience sharp enough to catch it, designed to reward people who were paying close attention while not interrupting the scene for anyone who was not. In November 1998, the joke read as a comment on corporate scale. A few years earlier, Disney had bought Capital Cities and ABC, which was one of the larger media acquisitions of the early 1990s. The joke was that Disney was buying everything, that eventually all of entertainment would funnel through one company, that the creeping consolidation of the industry was heading somewhere absurd. Making the Fox studio lot a Disney subsidiary was the logical endpoint of a pattern that already existed, pushed to a comic extreme that nobody expected to become literal. Mike Scully, who was executive producer at the time, later explained the gag in straightforward terms. He said it was a sign joke, a quick visual built around the exterior of the Fox building, poking fun at Disney's appetite for acquiring media companies. The writers needed something funny to put on the wall. Disney buying ABC was fresh in the cultural memory. The leap from that to Disney eventually owning Fox was the kind of thing that felt absurd enough to be funny without feeling like a real possibility. 19 years later, on December 14th, 2017, Disney announced that it was acquiring the majority of 21st Century Fox's properties in a deal worth $52.4 billion. The sign on the wall of a cartoon studio building and a throwaway background gag had named the acquisition nearly 2 decades before the paperwork was signed. ESPN reporter Darren Ravel posted a screenshot on social media the day of the announcement. The image spread immediately. The screenshot showed the Simpsons frame, Homer standing outside the Fox building, the Disney division text visible on the wall, and next to it, the news of the real merger. The internet did what the internet does with Simpsons predictions, which is to respond with something between amazement and a kind of amused inevitability, as if the show's record for this kind of thing had reached a point where another correct call registered as confirmation of something already understood. What makes this case different from the Trump prediction is the structure of the joke itself. The Trump detail was inside a story about the future, a deliberate fantasy sequence designed to explore what might happen. The Disney-Fox gag required no fantasy framing at all. The writers placed it in the background of a present-day scene, in the real world of the episode, as if the merger had already happened. There was no winking at the audience, no framing device that said, "This is what could be." The sign just existed, a quiet joke dressed as scenery, and the scenery turned out to be accurate. Rich Appel, who wrote the episode and later became a Family Guy executive producer, said he did not remember exactly how the detail came together, only that there was a general feeling in the writer's room that Disney would eventually own everything in the entertainment landscape. That feeling was not a prophecy. The writers were not looking at spreadsheets or industry reports. They were people who worked in television, who watched the media business the way the show watched everything, with attention and skepticism and a willingness to follow an idea to its logical conclusion, even when the conclusion looked ridiculous. The logical conclusion of Disney buying one major media company was Disney eventually buying another. The logical conclusion of corporate consolidation in entertainment was that fewer and fewer companies would own more and more of what people watched. That logic was available in 1998 to anyone paying attention to the industry. The Simpsons writers paid attention to the industry. They made the joke. The joke turned out not to be a joke. There is an additional detail inside the same scene that gets less attention than the Fox division gag, possibly because it requires knowing what came later. On the wall of the office where Ron Howard pitches the script, inside the Fox building, there is a Star Wars poster. Star Wars poster, Fox building, Ron Howard. In 1998, Star Wars was a George Lucas property with no obvious connection to either Fox or Disney, beyond the fact that Fox distributed the original films. Disney had no relationship with the franchise. Ron Howard had no connection to Star Wars. 14 years after the episode aired, Disney purchased Lucasfilm, and with it the complete Star Wars property, for $4 billion. Howard went on to direct a Star Wars film, Solo: A Star Wars Story, released in 2018. The same frame of a Simpsons episode from 1998 placed Ron Howard in a room with a Star Wars poster inside a building labeled as a Disney subsidiary. All three of those details came true. Not one of them. All three. That is the version of this case that gets underreported in the standard coverage of Simpsons predictions. The Fox merger is the headline. The Star Wars poster and Ron Howard's eventual involvement in the franchise are the fine print. But the fine print matters because it suggests something more interesting than a lucky guess. The writers of that episode were thinking about the way entertainment companies move, the way intellectual properties attach to directors and studios, the way money flows toward the things that already have name recognition and cultural weight. They put three different pieces of a future deal in a single background frame because those pieces were already connected in ways the entertainment industry had not yet made explicit. The actual Disney-Fox deal, when it was announced, covered more than Fox films. It included Fox's television studios, its cable networks, international satellite networks, and a significant stake in Hulu. It was one of the biggest media deals in history. The Simpsons, when the merger was confirmed, was suddenly a Disney property, which meant the show that had placed a Disney division sign on the Fox building as a joke was now literally owned by Disney. Al Jean, the show's longtime executive producer, responded to the merger announcement on social media with characteristic dryness. He predicted, he said, that people would make far too much of what was a mere coincidence. And he made that statement, knowing full well that it would itself be covered as evidence that the show could predict the future. The meta-commentary was deliberate. The writers were aware of their own reputation by 2017 and were not entirely comfortable with the mystical framing that surrounded it. The episode surrounding the gag is worth paying attention to in its own right. The core joke of When You Dish Upon a Star is about the gap between the image of celebrity and the reality of the people inside it. Baldwin and Basinger want to escape. Howard is willing to steal a script and pretend he came up with it. The studio machine operates in the background, absorbing everything, turning human creativity into product, moving money from one building to another. Homer, who does not fully understand any of this, walks through it with complete sincerity and ends up exactly where he started. The sign on the building is part of that texture, a visual acknowledgement that the industry Homer is brushing up against operates on a scale that he cannot quite see and would not care about even if he could. The writers dressed up a serious observation about corporate media as a single line of text on a cartoon wall. The observation was that consolidation was coming, that the entertainment landscape would continue to shrink toward fewer and larger entities, that one day the joke about Disney owning everything would stop being a joke. They filed that observation in the background of a celebrity comedy episode and moved on to the next production. 19 years later, a reporter took a screenshot and the world noticed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is smaller in scale and more specific than either of the first two. A single name written on a single prop, visible for a fraction of a second, that turned out to name the winner of one of the most prestigious prizes in the world, and then did it again. Section 3. The name on the betting sheet. The prop lasted less than a second on screen. A piece of paper, a grid of names, handwritten categories across the top. Physics, chemistry, economics, literature. Each column filled with the names of real people, actual scientists and writers and economists that the show's research team had pulled together. 4 cartoon children huddled on a couch in the early hours of the morning, watching a television, waiting for results to come in from Stockholm. The paper gets held up briefly, the camera catches it, and then the scene moves on. Most viewers never noticed it. The paper was not the joke. The joke was Homer walking in on his children awake at 4 a.m, finding them glued to the Nobel Prize announcements like other kids their age might be glued to a championship game. The paper was set dressing. It was the kind of background detail the Simpsons research team built into the show constantly. Real names, real institutions, real references packed into the corners of frames so the world of Springfield felt inhabited and specific rather than hollow. The episode was called Elementary School Musical. It was the first episode of Season 22, which aired on September 26, 2010. The main story followed Lisa getting enrolled in a performing arts camp, while Homer and Bart traveled to Oslo with Krusty, who had somehow won the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel betting pool was a background gag inside the opening sequence, a quick joke about the specific kind of nerd who treats academic prize season the way sports fans treat playoffs. 4 children with a pool, a grid of names, stakes that were comically low because Milhouse and Martin and Database and Lisa are not people who have money to gamble with. Under Milhouse's name, in the economics column, the sheet read, Bengt R. Holmstrom. Bengt Holmstrom was, in 2010, a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had spent his career working on contract theory, the study of how agreements between people and organizations can be structured to produce better outcomes. His work was respected inside the field. He was considered by the people who followed economics closely as someone whose contributions were significant enough to eventually earn major recognition. He was not a household name. He was not famous. He was an academic whose work mattered to other academics and to the industries that applied his ideas, and outside those circles, he was largely unknown. The Simpsons research team put his name on the betting sheet because they were building a realistic prop. They needed names that felt credible, economists who were genuinely in the conversation for the Nobel Prize in Economics, real scientists who could plausibly appear on a list that serious people might assemble. The names on that sheet were not random, they were researched. The team had done enough homework on the state of various Nobel Prize fields to populate the columns with people who actually belonged there. Milhouse's pick was Bengt Holmstrom. In October 2016, 6 years after the episode aired, Bengt Holmstrom won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. He shared the award with Oliver Hart of Harvard University. The committee recognized their work on contract theory, the same body of research that had made Holmstrom a credible name to put on a Nobel betting sheet 6 years earlier. Mitt noticed immediately. The university posted a screenshot from the episode on social media the afternoon of the announcement. A shot of Martin Prince holding the betting sheet, Holmstrom's name visible in Milhouse's column. The caption celebrated their professor's win and acknowledged that one of television's most beloved children had seen it coming in 2010. The post spread widely. NPR covered it. The Boston Globe covered it. Science journalists who had spent the week writing about contract theory suddenly found themselves also writing about Milhouse Van Houten and a cartoon betting pool. The reaction was partly amusement and partly something more genuinely strange, because this was not the Trump case, where a general cultural trajectory got named by writers following a satirical argument to its logical end. Holmstrom's name on that sheet required specific knowledge. Someone on the Simpsons research team had looked at the landscape of academic economics carefully enough to identify a real MIT professor as a credible Nobel Prize contender, put that name in a background prop, and turned out to be right 6 years later. The gap between a joke and a prediction, in this case, was measurable in actual research. But the Holmstrom case is not the most striking thing about that betting sheet. What gets significantly less attention is what happened 2 years before Holmstrom won. In the chemistry column, Milhouse had picked W.E. Morner, a chemist at Stanford University whose work on single molecules had been recognized within his field as foundational. The betting sheet listed him as a realistic contender for the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. In 2014, W.E. Morner won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The same piece of paper, the same prop, the same background detail assembled by the same research team in 2010. 2 names, 2 separate Nobel Prizes in 2 different fields. 2 correct picks from a cartoon children's betting pool, one paying off in 2014 and one paying off in 2016, 4 years apart across disciplines that have nothing to do with each other. This is the version of the story that makes the casual coincidence explanation feel genuinely strained. A single lucky guess on a single Nobel Prize is easy to absorb. 2 correct picks from the same prop in different scientific fields, winning 4 years apart? That requires a different kind of explanation, and the explanation is ultimately about the quality of the research that went into a throwaway gag. The Simpsons writers were not operating on instinct with that betting sheet. They were working with real information about real people who were genuinely considered to be at the top of their respective fields in 2010. The Nobel committees do not decide winners randomly. The prizes go to people who have spent careers producing work of a specific and recognized quality. The academic community typically has a reasonable sense of who is likely to win eventually, even if the specific year is unpredictable. When the Simpsons research team assembled that prop, they were drawing on the same body of informed opinion that academics and science journalists draw on when they make predictions about the prizes every October. The difference between a well-informed guess and a prediction is thinner than the mystical framing of Simpsons predictions coverage usually suggests. What the show did with that betting sheet was apply genuine research to a comedy prop and then let time do what time does. The names were credible in 2010. They remained credible. And eventually they were correct. The scene itself is constructed with the economy that Golden Era Simpsons trained viewers to expect, even if this was no longer the Golden Era. Homer walks in on the children. He calls the Nobel Prizes the Nobies, which is the specific kind of mispronunciation Homer deploys when he is trying to sound more familiar with something than he is. The chemistry Nobel gets announced, Jagdish Bhagwati wins the fictional prize, and Martin celebrates because he had Bhagwati in the pool. Homer says, lucky. The economics prize is not announced in the scene. The whole sequence is maybe 90 seconds of screen time, built to establish that these children are the kind of children who stay up until 4 a.m. to watch academic prize announcements, and that Homer's response to this is both baffled and vaguely proud. Nothing in that scene points to the sheet. The sheet is not the scene's punchline. The scene's punchline is Homer and the children, and the particular texture of a household where the kids are dramatically smarter than the parent. The sheet exists to make the betting pool feel real, to give the gag something to rest on so it does not float away into pure abstraction. and yet the sheet is the thing that lasted. There is a quality to the Milhouse character that makes his role in this case quietly appropriate. Milhouse Van Houten is not a character the show treats as particularly perceptive. He is the loyal, slightly pathetic best friend, the kid who follows Bart into trouble without understanding why, the kid who gets his heart broken repeatedly and never fully learns from it, the kid who exists in the background of other people's more significant moments. His signature phrase, "Everything's coming up Milhouse," is a sarcastic celebration of small victories that only feel large because the baseline is so low. Milhouse picking banged Holmstrom and being right is consistent with the show's long history of placing accurate information inside characters who are not supposed to be accurate. The Simpsons built an enormous amount of its comedy on the gap between who a character is and what they turn out to know or do. Homer is not supposed to be capable of most of the things Homer eventually does. Bart is not supposed to have genuine emotional intelligence, but the show gives it to him in the moments that matter. Milhouse is not supposed to be a credible analyst of academic economics. The show made him one for a single frame and then moved on. That movement, the show placing something precise and true in the hands of a character who should not possess it, and then moving on without comment, is the mechanism that makes the Simpsons prediction cases so consistently surprising when they resolve. The camera never lingers on these details. The show never returns to them. They are placed in the world with complete casualness and then left there, and the world eventually catches up to them on its own timeline without any assistance from the show that created them. The Nobel Committee, when it announced Holmstrom's win in 2016, was not thinking about a Simpsons episode from 2010. Holmstrom, when he received the news, was almost certainly not thinking about Milhouse Van Houten. The connection between the cartoon and the prize was made by the people who saw both. The audience that had watched the episode in 2010, stored the memory somewhere, and retrieved it when the October announcement arrived. MIT's social media team found the screenshot and posted it. The connection spread from there. What the spread of that image revealed is something worth noting about how the Simpsons predictions function culturally. The show has been watched by so many people across so many years that its details exist in an enormous number of memories simultaneously. When a real event happens that connects to a detail from a Simpsons episode, the recognition does not need to be organized or coordinated. It happens automatically, across millions of people at once, because the show has been so thoroughly embedded in the cultural memory of several generations that its contents are perpetually available for comparison with whatever the real world produces. The betting sheet from Elementary School Musical was sitting in the memory of everyone who had watched that episode since 2010. When Holmstrom won in 2016, those memories activated. When Murner had won in 2014, the same thing had happened, though with slightly less cultural momentum, because the pattern of Simpsons predictions had not yet been discussed as thoroughly as it would be by 2016. By the time both picks on the same sheet had come through, the argument that this was pure coincidence required more work than the argument that the research team had done genuinely good work in 2010. 2 disciplines, 2 winners, 6 years of waiting, 1 prop in 1 episode that most people had not noticed the first time they watched it. The show moved on to the next episode. The season continued, the years went by, and the sheet sat inside a frame of animation that most people had watched once in 2010 and never thought about again, carrying 2 names that the world would eventually confirm. Milhouse, when Holmstrom won in 2016, did not get to say he told them so. He is a cartoon. But the Simpsons writers noted in interviews following the announcement that the research team had done real work assembling that prop, and that real work produced results that looked like something more magical than research tends to look. The show's reputation for prediction makes every confirmed case feel like evidence of something mysterious. The mundane explanation, that careful attention to the real world produces accurate representations of what the real world is likely to do, is available but less satisfying and therefore less popular. What Milhouse's betting sheet actually demonstrates is something worth holding on to as this essay moves forward. The Simpsons was, at its best, a show written by people who paid close attention to politics, to culture, to science, to the entertainment industry, to the patterns underneath public life that most people move through without stopping to examine. The predictions that look most like magic are almost always the ones where that attention was applied most carefully, where the research was most specific, and where the writers followed the logic of what they found far enough to land on something true. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is different from the first three in one important way. The prediction did not come from careful observation of a slow-moving pattern. The episode aired. The real event happened 3 months later, and one of the things predicted was not a future possibility. It was the result of a sporting competition that had not yet been played. Section 4. The referee, the crooks, and the score. Homer Simpson has no business refereeing a World Cup match. That is, again, the basic truth underneath the premise of You Don't Have to Live Like a Referee, which aired on March 30th, 2014, the 16th episode of Season 25. The episode exists because Lisa gives a speech at Springfield Elementary about her hero, and the speech goes viral, and the viral moment catches the attention of a representative from the World Football Federation, who shows up in Springfield looking for someone with genuine integrity to referee the upcoming World Cup in Brazil. The episode turns on a quality Homer does not usually possess, honesty, and watches what happens when a man who is genuinely not suited to operating in a corrupt environment is placed inside one anyway. The comedy works because Homer is wrong for the job in almost every way except the one way that matters. He does not understand the politics. He does not understand the pressure. He does not understand the history or the money or the machinery running underneath the surface of international football. What he understands is that a foul is a foul and a dive is a dive, and the score at the end of a game should reflect what actually happened on the field. That quality in the world of this episode makes him dangerously unusual. The episode aired 3 months before the 2014 World Cup began in Brazil. By the time the tournament kicked off in June, the Simpsons writers had already put their predictions on screen. By the time it ended in July, the first of those predictions had been confirmed. And 14 months after the episode aired, the second prediction landed in ways that produced headlines across the world. The episode contains 2 distinct things that came true. They need to be taken separately because they are separate kinds of accuracy. The first is the World Cup result. In the episode, the tournament final is played between Brazil and Germany. Homer, who had briefly taken a bribe from local gangsters before finding his conscience again, referees the match. A Brazilian player known as El Divo, a character built around the real habit of certain footballers to fall dramatically and claim injuries that are not there, goes down near the end of the game. Homer, following Lisa's advice about integrity, reads the fall as a dive rather than a genuine injury and refuses to award Brazil a penalty. Germany wins. In the real 2014 World Cup, Germany won the tournament. They defeated Argentina 1-0 in the final. Brazil did not make the final. They were eliminated in the semifinals by Germany in one of the most shocking results in World Cup history, a match that ended 7-1 and became one of the most discussed sporting events of that decade. Neymar, Brazil's most important player, had been injured in the quarterfinal and missed the semifinal, an injury that occurred during a game, the result of contact that was initially unclear, in circumstances that drew enormous attention. His absence was widely cited as a major factor in the collapse that followed. El Divo in the Simpsons episode is a direct parody of Neymar. The character dives. He theatrically claims injury. He is the kind of player who manipulates referees through performance. The real Neymar, by the time the World Cup came around, had a genuine injury that took him out of the tournament's most critical match. The parody and the reality did not land in exactly the same way. The episode imagined a fake injury used to cheat, while the real situation involved a genuine injury that changed the tournament. But the connection between the fictional character and the real player was close enough that journalists noted it widely once the quarterfinal was over. Germany winning the World Cup was the result the episode predicted. They won it. The detail about beating Brazil specifically, and Germany winning the whole thing, was correct in the broad strokes, even if the path was different. The episode had Germany defeating Brazil in the final. In reality, Germany destroyed Brazil in the semifinals, and then won the final against Argentina. The Simpsons got the winner right, got Brazil as a key opponent right, and built an episode around Germany's superiority in that particular tournament, months before the tournament started. The episode's construction of Germany as the dominant team in the 2014 World Cup is worth understanding in context. By 2014, the German national team had been building towards something for over a decade. They had finished third in the 2006 World Cup, which they hosted. They had reached the semifinals in 2010. Their youth development system had been rebuilt after a period of underperformance in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the results of that rebuilding were visible across the German squad that arrived in Brazil. Football analysts and journalists had been writing about Germany's depth and organization and consistency throughout the qualifying period. The episode's writers, doing the same kind of research that went into every Simpsons episode that engaged with a real sporting event, would have been reading about a German team that most serious observers considered among the favorites. Choosing Germany to win the tournament was not a mystical leap. It was an informed decision about which team's strengths, at that particular moment in the history of the tournament, made them the most likely winner. The detail that made the prediction remarkable was not Germany winning, it was the specific construction of the Brazil-Germany match at the center of the episode. In a tournament hosted by Brazil, with a Brazilian player as the antagonist of Homer's referee story. The episode placed Germany and Brazil in direct opposition and had Germany win. The reality placed them in direct opposition in a semifinal and had Germany win 7-1, which was a scoreline that nobody anywhere had predicted. The second prediction is the one that carried more weight in the long run. The structure of the episode's conflict rests on corruption. The World Football Federation representative, who comes to Springfield to recruit Homer, is presented as someone swimming in an organization where dishonesty is standard practice. He tells Homer that the rot is everywhere, that bribery and manipulation have become so routine in his organization that they specifically need someone from outside it, someone who has no relationship with how the game actually operates at the level of money and politics, in order to find a referee who might just call fouls honestly. In the middle of a conversation with Homer about the state of football governance, the Federation representative gets arrested, right there, mid-scene. Corruption charges. The episode played this as a dark comedy beat. The organization desperately searching for integrity is itself riddled with the opposite, and the person doing the searching is not exempt. Homer ends up in Brazil as the lone honest actor in an ecosystem where honesty is the rarest possible quality. On May 27, 2015, 14 months after the episode aired, the United States Department of Justice announced the indictment of 14 individuals connected to FIFA, the real governing body of world football. Senior officials were arrested at a hotel in Zurich, Switzerland, as they gathered for a FIFA Congress. The charges covered decades of bribery and corruption connected to the awarding of media rights, sponsorship agreements, and the hosting rights for major tournaments. It was one of the largest corruption prosecutions in the history of sport. FIFA officials had been taking bribes for years at the highest levels of the organization. The episode episode that had depicted a fictional football federation so corrupt that its own representative gets arrested mid-conversation about integrity turned out to be a more accurate portrait of FIFA's internal culture than most sports journalism had managed in the preceding decade. The arrests in Zurich were dramatic in the way that the episode's mid-scene arrest was dramatic. Sudden, public, happening at a moment when the people being arrested were in the middle of conducting official business. Several senior FIFA officials were taken from their hotel rooms early in the morning by Swiss authorities acting on behalf of the American indictment. The same men who had been voting on hosting rights and governance matters were led through the lobby of a luxury hotel in handcuffs. The gap between the official performance of FIFA as a well-run international sports organization and the reality of what was happening inside it collapsed in that lobby in Zurich, in the same way that the World Football Federation representative's arrest mid-speech collapsed the pretense of the fictional organization in the episode. The episode's writer, Michael Price, later acknowledged the FIFA connection in interviews, and the Simpsons researchers were credited with building the episode around corruption stories that had been circulating about FIFA for years before the formal charges arrived. This is the same pattern that showed up with the Disney Fox gag and with the Holmstrom betting sheet. The show's research team paying close attention to real information that was already available, then following it to a conclusion that turned out to be correct. The FIFA corruption had not been secret in 2014. Investigative journalists had been writing about bribery allegations involving FIFA for years. The organization had survived multiple rounds of scrutiny. Nobody had yet managed to bring formal charges. The Simpsons episode was not drawing on secret information. It was drawing on widely reported concerns that had not yet been acted on, building them into a comedy plot, and arriving at the same destination the Department of Justice would reach a year later. The scale of the real FIFA investigation went well beyond the initial 14 indictments. As the prosecution developed across subsequent years, additional charges were filed against more officials. The investigation eventually implicated over 40 individuals and several corporate entities. The charges covered bribery related to marketing and broadcasting rights across multiple continents, payments connected to the selection of World Cup host nations, and corruption in the governance of regional football federations across South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and beyond. The episode had depicted an organization where the rot was everywhere. The investigation confirmed that the rot had been, in fact, everywhere, embedded across multiple regions, multiple eras of leadership, multiple generations of officials who had inherited a corrupt system and continued operating within it because the system worked for the people inside it. The episode treats Homer's honesty as the joke. The idea that a man who has stolen donuts from his own children, caused multiple nuclear incidents through negligence, and deceived Marge in ways too numerous to catalog is somehow the most trustworthy person the World Football Federation can find, that is the comedy. But underneath the comedy is a portrait of an institution where the bar for integrity had dropped low enough that Homer Simpson qualified. What the episode understood, and what the real FIFA scandal confirmed, is that large organizations with enormous amounts of money flowing through them and limited accountability can sustain corruption for a very long time. The fiction did not need to invent the corruption. It just needed to follow the corruption already documented to its natural conclusion. Officials getting arrested, the institution exposed, the charade of clean governance collapsed. Lisa's role in the episode adds a dimension that the prediction coverage rarely addresses. The episode begins with Lisa writing a speech about her hero and eventually settling on Homer. Not because Homer is objectively heroic, but because Bart convinces her to choose him, and she finds herself having to discover whether the praise she invented is actually true. The episode is partly about the relationship between expectation and reality, about whether telling someone they are better than they are can actually make them better. Homer resists taking the bribe for most of the episode because Lisa has said publicly that he is honest, and living up to that description becomes something he is not willing to abandon. The corruption story underneath the episode is not separate from the character story. It is the same story. An organization full of people who have accepted that dishonesty is simply how the game is played encounters a single person who has been told and has decided to believe that he is honest. The contrast is the engine of the plot, and the corruption of the real FIFA, when it was exposed in 2015, produced the same contrast. An organization that had normalized dishonesty so thoroughly that the existence of actual honest governance felt exotic. Homer wins in the episode. He calls the game honestly. Germany wins. The gangsters who bribed him are furious. Marge negotiates their freedom by speaking Portuguese. The family gets home. The World Football Federation does not seem particularly transformed by the experience. The corruption was systemic, and one honest referee does not fix systemic corruption. The episode is self-aware about this in a way that most coverage of its predictions tends to overlook. It does not suggest that Homer's integrity changes anything at the structural level. The machinery keeps turning. The rot, as the representative said, is everywhere. 3 months after the episode aired, Germany won the World Cup. 14 months after the episode aired, FIFA officials were let out of a Swiss hotel in handcuffs. 2 predictions from one episode of a cartoon comedy confirmed across a 14-month window covering a sport that the United States does not traditionally pay much attention to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case does not involve politics or prize committees or corruption scandals. The next case involves a performer and a stage and an aerial rig, and a performance so specific in its details that the show did not just predict the event, it described the outfit, the wire stunt, the piano, and the lights 5 years before the night in question arrived. Section 5. The Wire, the Outfit, and the Stage. The episode has a reputation problem. Lisa Goes Gaga is the 22nd episode of Season 23, which aired in May 2012. Among Simpsons fans, it is not remembered warmly. The critical consensus at the time was mixed at best. The episode follows Lady Gaga traveling to Springfield on her tour train after learning through media coverage that Springfield has been ranked the most depressed city in America. She decides to fix this by visiting and performing and paying particular attention to Lisa, who has been voted least popular student at Springfield Elementary through an anonymous online poll. The episode is, in the blunt assessment of most people who have watched it closely, one of the weaker entries of the modern era. The story is thin. The resolution asks the audience to accept that a pop star personally intervening in a child's social life is both plausible and emotionally satisfying. The musical numbers, which take up a significant portion of the runtime, divide viewers along the same lines that most Simpsons musical numbers have divided viewers since the show started leaning into them more heavily in the later seasons. Lady Gaga played herself. She was a fan of the show. She agreed to voice the character, which meant the episode has the actual Lady Gaga performing actual Lady Gaga songs inside a cartoon version of her own stage show. The production team built the animated concert around what Lady Gaga's real performances looked like at that point in her career. The theatrical costumes, the elaborate staging, the aerial elements she had been incorporating into her live shows, the piano that appeared in her more stripped back moments. None of that in 2000 2012 looked like a prediction. It looked like a celebrity episode that depicted a celebrity doing roughly what that celebrity was already known for doing. On February 5th, 2017, Lady Gaga performed the halftime show at Super Bowl 51 in Houston, Texas. The first thing she did was drop from the roof of NRG Stadium. She was suspended from cables attached to a rig above the stadium, dressed in a silver jumpsuit with knee-high boots, and she descended from the rafters of the building into the space above the stage below, while the crowd watched. The opening was one of the most discussed moments of that year's Super Bowl. The image of a performer dropping from the roof of a stadium on wires, lit from below, arriving at the stage from above, rather than walking onto it from the side. It was theatrical in the specific way Lady Gaga's performances had always been theatrical, but scaled up to the size of the biggest single-night television audience in the United States. People who had watched Lisa Goes Gaga 5 years earlier recognized it immediately. The animated concert in the episode shows Lady Gaga flying above the crowd attached to wires. Her outfit in the episode is silver, sparkly, and includes knee-high boots. At one point in the episode's performance sequence, she sits at a piano. The stage is elaborate. The lighting creates specific visual shapes above the crowd. The whole construction is big in the way that Super Bowl halftime shows are big. Theatrical, expensive looking, designed to fill an enormous space. Every one of those details appeared in the real halftime show in 2017. The wire descent, the silver outfit, the piano moment, the lights above the crowd, the outfit change. In the episode, she changes into a two-piece silver look, and in Houston, she changed into a white, football-inspired top with silver sequin shorts. The costume details were not identical, but the structure of the change, mid-performance, from one silver look to another, was the same. Side-by-side images of the animated Lady Gaga and the real Lady Gaga spread across the internet within hours of the halftime show ending. The comparisons were specific enough that they required no explanation. The wire image alone, a cartoon woman in silver suspended above a crowd on cables, placed next to a photograph of the real woman in a silver jumpsuit, suspended above a crowd on cables, communicated everything. The halftime show at Super Bowl 51 was itself a significant cultural event beyond the prediction connection. The game was one of the most dramatic in Super Bowl history. The New England Patriots overcame a 28-3 deficit in the third quarter to defeat the Atlanta Falcons in overtime, producing what remained for years the largest comeback in Super Bowl history. The halftime show, sandwiched between two halves of that extraordinary game, received enormous attention on its own terms. Lady Gaga's performance was widely reviewed as one of the best halftime shows in the event's history. Tightly choreographed, visually spectacular, moving between different eras of her catalog with precision. The Simpsons connection was noted in that context of genuine quality. The show did not just accidentally describe a mediocre performance. It described a performance that most critics considered excellent, which meant the cartoon had not only predicted the structure and visual vocabulary of the show, but had predicted a version of a Lady Gaga performance that was operating at the highest possible level. There is something worth sitting with about how the 2012 episode came to look the way it did. The Simpsons production team, when building the Lisa Goes Gaga concert sequences, was working from Lady Gaga's existing live show aesthetic. By 2012, she had already established herself as a performer whose concerts used elaborate theatrical staging, costumes, flying rigs, piano moments, dramatic visual set pieces. The writers and animators building the episode were depicting what Lady Gaga's concerts already looked like, pushed slightly toward the cartoon version of excess that the show applies to everything. The Super Bowl halftime show in 2017 did not require Lady Gaga to invent a new performance identity. It required her to scale up what she already did to fill the dimensions of one of the largest live television moments in the world. When she and her team sat down to design the halftime show, they were drawing from the same vocabulary of performance that had already been documented in 5 years of live shows, music videos, and public appearances. The flying rig was something she had used before. The silver aesthetic was established. The piano was a recurring element of her live performances going back years. The Simpsons episode and the Super Bowl halftime show were both drawing from the same source, Lady Gaga's existing performance language, and arrived at similar results. The episode in 2012 was describing what Lady Gaga concerts look like. The halftime show in 2017 was what Lady Gaga concerts look like applied to the biggest stage available. That explanation is the honest one, and it still leaves something unexplained. Because the specific combination of elements, the wire descent as the opening move, the silver outfit, the piano, the lights, the mid-show costume change, all present in both the 2012 cartoon and the 2017 performance, is more than the general principle that both productions were drawing from the same performer's aesthetic. The episode did not just depict Lady Gaga doing Lady Gaga things in a general sense. It depicted a specific kind of show that she had not yet done in that specific configuration. The Super Bowl halftime show was not a regular tour stop. It was a different kind of production, designed specifically for that event, at a scale she had not previously worked at. The episode described that production 5 years before she designed it. Designing a Super Bowl halftime show involves a specific set of constraints that do not apply to a regular concert. The stage setup is built in minutes during halftime. The performer has approximately 13 minutes. The television audience is measured in hundreds of millions of people rather than the tens of thousands in an arena. The show cannot depend on the kind of slow-building atmospheric setup that works in a controlled concert environment. It has to establish its visual and emotional identity within the first 30 seconds, while also making sense to people watching on television who are not in the stadium. The wire descent from the roof addressed all of those constraints simultaneously. It was immediately dramatic. It was visually clear on television. It established the scale of the production without requiring any setup. The audience understood immediately that this was going to be a large and ambitious performance. It got Lady Gaga from the rafters to the stage in a way that was itself the opening act rather than a transition to the opening act. The Simpsons episode had placed Lady Gaga on a wire above the crowd without knowing those constraints. The episode was depicting a concert, not a halftime show, but the visual logic that made the wire descent work as a halftime show opener was already present in the cartoon concert sequence 5 years earlier. There is one additional detail that appeared in both the episode and the halftime show that gets less attention than the wire moment. In the animated concert, there is a sequence where lights are arranged in formations above the stadium, shapes created by moving lights that create a visual pattern over the crowd. During the Super Bowl halftime show, Lady Gaga had a pre-recorded segment where hundreds of drones flew in formation above the stadium, creating shapes and patterns in the air, including the American flag. The drone technology in 2017 was new enough that the formation sequence was one of the most talked about technical elements of the production. In 2012, the episode had placed formation lights above the crowd, doing something visually similar. The drone sequence was actually pre-recorded and composited into the broadcast rather than performed live on the night, due to restrictions on drone flight over stadiums during live events. But it appeared in the broadcast. It created exactly the kind of overhead visual formation that the 2012 episode had placed in its concert sequence. A viewer watching the halftime show on television would have seen lights arranged in formation above the stage, the same image the animated concert had produced 5 years earlier. Lady Gaga also played the piano during the halftime show, performing a stripped-back version of one of her songs in the middle of the production, before the show escalated again toward its finale. The piano moment in the episode serves the same structural function, a pause in the spectacle, a more intimate beat inside a very large performance, before the energy builds again. The piano detail matters because it is not an obvious element of a stadium-scale performance. Flying rigs and elaborate costumes are easy to predict for a performer whose concerts had always used them. The piano suggests something different, a choice to slow down inside a show that could have been pure spectacle, to strip back the production and let the performer exist in a more exposed way before returning to the bigger elements. That choice requires a particular kind of confidence. The performer has to trust that the audience will stay with them through the quieter moment, that the contrast between the large and the small will make both feel more significant. The 2012 episode placed that choice inside its animated concert. The 2017 halftime show made the same choice in reality. Both the cartoon Lady Gaga and the real Lady Gaga used the piano as the moment where the performance breathed before accelerating again toward its close. The episode is not well loved. That context matters for how the prediction reads. If Lisa Goes Gaga were a celebrated piece of Simpsons history, the halftime show connection would feel different. It would land as the show at its best, somehow also being the show at its most prophetic. The reality is more interesting. A mediocre episode from a weaker season of the show's run, built around a celebrity guest appearance and a fairly thin story about popularity, turned out to contain a more accurate description of a future cultural event than almost anyone could have constructed deliberately in 2012. The quality of the surrounding episode had nothing to do with the accuracy of the details inside the concert sequence. The prediction did not care whether the episode was good. What the case demonstrates, when placed next to the other predictions in this collection, is that the Simpsons predictions do not cluster in the show's best episodes. They appear across the show's run, in good seasons and weak ones, in well-constructed stories and thin ones, in moments that the show intended as climaxes, and moments that existed only as set dressing. The accuracy is not connected to artistic quality. It is connected to observation, to the research team's habit of filling the show's world with real details, real names, real aesthetic references, real extrapolations of existing patterns. Those habits operated regardless of whether the episode they were applied to was going to be remembered as a classic. What Lady Gaga herself made of the comparison when clips and screenshots circulated in February 2017 was not widely documented. She did not issue a statement about the Simpsons episode. Her team did not weigh in publicly on the parallel. The internet made the connection without any assistance from the subject of the prediction, which is also how most of these cases work. The show produces something, the world eventually produces something similar, and the distance between the two collapses in a moment of recognition that neither side had been working toward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case does not involve a performer or a concert or a stage. The next case is the longest gap in this entire collection. 28 years between a 30-second joke and the night that joke became real, in a room that had hosted royalty and classical music for over a century, with the exact song named in the cartoon performed by the exact group the cartoon had depicted. Section 6. The orchestra nobody ordered. The joke was never supposed to be plausible. That was the point. The Simpsons, at its best, found comedy in combinations that felt genuinely impossible. Things so far apart from each other that putting them in the same frame produced a kind of absurdist electricity. A hip-hop group from Los Angeles and the London Symphony Orchestra performing together on the same stage was that kind of combination in 1996. The distance between those two worlds, The sound, the culture, the audience, the history, the clothes, the everything was so large that the joke did not need a punchline. The combination was the punchline. Homerpalooza is the 24th episode of Season 7, which aired on May 19, 1996. The episode follows Homer trying to connect with Bart and Lisa by proving he still understands music. He ends up at a traveling music festival, a clear reference to Lollapalooza, the touring alternative music festival that had become a defining event of the early 1990s American music scene. Homer eventually becomes a sideshow act at the festival, taking a cannonball to the stomach night after night because his stomach has somehow developed the ability to absorb the impact. The episode is a sharp and affectionate examination of what happens to people who were young when a cultural moment happened and are now watching that moment age around them. The musical acts featured in the episode were real. The Smashing Pumpkins, Peter Frampton, Sonic Youth, and Cypress Hill all appeared as animated versions of themselves, voice acted by the actual musicians. This was The Simpsons at the height of its cultural reach, the show that everyone watched, where appearing as a cartoon version of yourself had become a genuine marker of cultural relevance. Cypress Hill were at that point one of the most successful hip-hop groups in the world. Their album Black Sunday, released in 1993, had debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, one of the first hip-hop albums to do so. They were known for their dense, heavy sound, their lyrics, and a public persona that leaned heavily into a particular kind of West Coast attitude. They were not people that anyone in 1996 would have naturally placed next to a symphony orchestra. The gag happens backstage at the festival. A coordinator with a clipboard appears, looking confused. Tuxedo-clad musicians are visible in the doorway behind her, clearly out of place at a festival built around loud guitars and alternative culture. The coordinator looks at her clipboard and asks who ordered the London Symphony Orchestra. She looks directly at Cypress Hill. Possibly while high, she adds. The band members mutter amongst themselves and confirm that, yes, they think they did. One of them asks whether the orchestra knows Insane in the Brain, their most famous song. A violinist responds that they mostly know classical, but they could give it a shot. The scene lasts maybe 30 seconds. Homer watches the two groups perform together and is genuinely delighted by the result. Marge agrees. The joke moves on. The episode has other things to do. That 30-second scene sat inside a Season 7 episode for 28 years. On July 10, 2024, Cypress Hill performed a full concert at the Royal Albert Hall in London, backed by the London Symphony Orchestra. They played Insane in the Brain. The concert was not a spontaneous event. It was a planned production celebrating the 30th anniversary of Black Sunday, the album that had made Cypress Hill one of the most recognizable names in hip-hop. The Royal Albert Hall, one of the most prestigious concert venues in the world, a building that opened in 1871 as a tribute to Prince Albert by Queen Victoria, a place where the London Symphony Orchestra has performed for generations, hosted a hip-hop group from Los Angeles, playing with a full orchestra behind them. The two worlds that the 1996 Simpsons joke had placed together as an act of pure absurdity came together in a real room in London 28 years later. The New York Times covered it. The Smithsonian Magazine covered it. The Hollywood Reporter covered it. Every major piece of coverage noted the Simpsons episode. Every piece of coverage noted that the same song referenced in the cartoon, Insane in the Brain, was performed at the real event. The connection was impossible to miss and too specific to explain away as coincidence. The episode had not just predicted that Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra would perform together, the episode had named the song. Be Real and Sendog, the core members of Cypress Hill, were dressed in suits for the performance. The group that had built its identity around a very specific kind of West Coast energy stood on the stage of one of England's most formal concert halls in formal clothing, backed by musicians in tuxedos, performing the catalog of an album that turned 30 years old in 2023. The Simpsons had shown the tuxedo-clad orchestra backstage at Lollapalooza. The reality placed Cypress Hill in suits at the Royal Albert Hall. The direction of formality had flipped. In the cartoon, the orchestra was in the wrong place, and in reality, the hip-hop group had dressed for the orchestra's world. But the combination the cartoon had treated as the height of absurdity was real and was being reviewed by serious music journalists as a genuinely good show. The review in the New York Times noted that the sound inside the concert hall was substantial, and that there were more neck tattoos and vapes than the venue typically hosted. That detail, the collision of the Royal Albert Hall's traditional audience with the particular crowd that Cypress Hill brings with them, was the same tension the Simpsons episode had built its joke around in 1996. The two worlds were still different. The show was still a collision. The collision was still the point. The Simpsons had understood that the collision would eventually happen, even if nobody involved could have planned it that way. The Royal Albert Hall has a specific history that makes the venue choice for the 2024 concert significant beyond just prestige. The hall has hosted an enormous range of performances across its century and a half of existence: classical concerts, rock shows, boxing matches, political events, film screenings, and ceremonies of various kinds. Its programming has always been broader than its reputation as a classical venue suggests. But it is still, in the public imagination, a place associated with a certain kind of formal musical culture. The choice to hold a Cypress Hill concert there, backed by a symphony orchestra, was a deliberate collision of associations. A statement about where hip-hop sat in the culture in 2024 relative to where it had sat in 1993 when Black Sunday was released. In 1993, when Black Sunday came out, hip-hop was still fighting for recognition as a legitimate art form in the spaces where those arguments happen: critical institutions, mainstream media coverage, award ceremonies. The idea that a hip-hop group would one day perform at the Royal Albert Hall with the London Symphony Orchestra was not just unlikely in 1993. It would have read as a category error, as something from a different kind of world than the one hip-hop occupied. The Simpsons made the joke in 1996 precisely because it read as a category error. The comedy required the audience to understand that these two things were from completely different worlds, that the combination was absurd, that the orchestra being backstage at Lollapalooza was fundamentally the wrong thing in the wrong place. The joke worked because everyone watching understood the distance between the two worlds. 28 years later, that distance had closed enough that the combination was not only plausible, but celebrated. There is something worth sitting with in the specific length of that gap. 28 years is the longest confirmed gap in this entire collection of predictions. The Disney-Fox merger took 19 years. The horse meat scandal took 19 years. The three-eyed fish took 21 years. The Cypress Hill and London Symphony Orchestra case took 28. The gap is not just long, it represents a genuine cultural shift, a change in what the music world considered possible and appropriate that had to happen before the event could happen. The other predictions in this essay did not require the world to fundamentally change its values before they could come true. Germany winning a World Cup was always possible. It was a question of when, not whether. A Disney-Fox merger was conceivable in 1998 as a business outcome. The question was whether it would actually happen. A Nobel Prize winner being correctly identified in advance was a matter of research quality and timing. These were outcomes within the range of what the world already knew how to produce. Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra required the culture to travel far enough that the combination no longer registered as impossible. That journey took 28 years and involved a generational shift in how hip-hop was understood, valued, and placed within the broader landscape of musical achievement. There is something worth sitting with about this case that separates it from the others in this collection, in terms of how the prediction actually functioned. Every other case involves the show describing something that then happened independently, with no connection between the cartoon and the event. The Cypress Hill case raises the possibility that the cartoon and the event were not fully independent, that the Simpsons prediction stories sometimes work the other way around, with the show's imagination becoming a blueprint that real people eventually build from. Cypress Hill themselves acknowledged the Simpsons episode in interviews around the time of the Royal Albert Hall concert. They were aware of the cartoon gag. They had been aware of it for years. Sendog confirmed in a 2024 interview that the episode had planted the idea in some form, that knowing the Simpsons had made that specific joke about their group and the London Symphony Orchestra had made the actual collaboration feel like something worth doing eventually. The cartoon absurdity had become, over time, something to work toward rather than something to laugh at. This changes the structure of the prediction in a meaningful way. The Simpsons placed an image in the world in 1996. The people who would eventually make that image real saw it, absorbed it, and carried it forward across decades until the cultural conditions existed for it to become real. The prediction did not just accidentally describe a future event. The prediction may have seeded the ambition that produced the event. That is not something that can be said about any other case in this collection. Trump did not become president because The Simpsons said he would. Disney did not buy Fox because a sign on a cartoon building described the deal. Holmstrom did not win the Nobel Prize because Milhouse had him in a pool. But Cypress Hill may have performed at the Royal Albert Hall in part because a 30-second cartoon gag in 1996 put that image in their minds and let it sit there for 28 years until it felt possible. Whether or not that causal chain is exactly right, and Sendog's comments suggest it has at least some truth to it, the concert happened. The song was performed. 28 years after a 30-second background gag treated the combination as the definition of absurdity, the combination stood on the stage of one of the world's most prestigious venues and received a standing ovation from an audience that included people with neck tattoos and people in evening wear sitting in the same room, which is also something the 1996 episode would have found funny. The Royal Albert Hall has hosted performances by every major classical musician of the 20th century. It has hosted rock concerts and comedy shows, and political events and sporting demonstrations. After July 10, 2024, it had hosted Cypress Hill performing Insane in the Brain with a full symphony orchestra exactly as a cartoon had depicted in 1996, and the violinist who had said they mostly knew classical but could give it a shot had been prophetic in the specific way The Simpsons was prophetic, not because anyone was trying to predict anything, but because the logic of the joke pointed somewhere true. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is not about music or sport or politics or prizes. The next case begins with a drum of food labeled in a way that should have been a warning, and ends with one of the largest food scandals in European history, confirming that the warning had been accurate 19 years before the scandal broke. Section 7. What was actually in the drum? Lunch Lady Doris did not ask questions. That was part of her character design. She was a woman who had worked in a school cafeteria long enough to stop caring about the specifics of what she was serving. The children would eat it or they would not. The administration would not inspect it closely. The food would move through the system and the system would continue, and nobody at any level of the operation had any particular interest in looking at what was inside the containers being opened and emptied and served to Springfield's children every day. The episode is Sweet Seymour Skinner's Badass Song, the 19th episode of Season 5, which aired on April 28, 1994. The main story follows Principal Skinner getting fired after Santa's little helper gets loose in the school building during show and tell and causes chaos, with Bart feeling unexpectedly guilty about the role he played in getting Skinner dismissed. The episode is a character study about a relationship that the show had built carefully across 5 seasons. The specific, strange dynamic between a boy who dedicates enormous energy to making a man's life difficult and the realization that he actually needs that man's presence to give the energy somewhere to go. The cafeteria scene is not central to any of that. It is a background moment. A quick visual designed to communicate something about the quality of the food being served at Springfield Elementary without requiring much time to establish it. Lunch Lady Doris is ladling food onto trays. The drum she is working from is visible in the frame. On the side of the drum, in plain text, are the words, "Assorted horse parts." The label is the joke. The joke requires no explanation. The audience sees the label, understands immediately what it means about the food being served, and moves on. The scene does not linger. Nobody comments on the drum. No character points at it and says, "This is disturbing." The horror is embedded in the detail, and the detail passes by quickly, which is the specific Simpsons technique that made the show's background jokes so effective. The funniest things are often the things the camera is not trying to show you. In January 2013, food safety authorities in Ireland announced that they had found horse DNA in beef burgers being sold in major supermarkets across Ireland and the United Kingdom. The initial announcement identified horse DNA in products sold at Tesco, Iceland, Lidl, and Aldi, some of the largest and most widely used supermarket chains in both countries. The levels varied. Some products contained small traces, others contained significant amounts. One product tested positive for content that was nearly entirely horse rather than beef. The announcement triggered an immediate and expanding investigation. Testing expanded beyond burgers to ready meals, frozen products, and processed meat products across the United Kingdom, and then into mainland Europe. France became a major focus of the investigation when it emerged that a French company called Spanghero had been supplying meat labeled as beef that contained horse. The meat had passed through a chain of suppliers across multiple countries before reaching consumers, and at each step the labeling had described it as beef. By the time the full scope of the scandal was documented, horse meat had been found in products sold across the United Kingdom, Ireland, France, Sweden, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, Romania, and several other European countries. 14 countries in total were affected. Products from multiple major brands had been found to contain meat that was not what the label said it was. In some cases, the horse content was so high that the product could not accurately be described as a beef product at all. The scale of what had been happening was significant enough that it triggered a formal European Union response, a series of parliamentary inquiries in multiple countries, criminal investigations into several companies, and a lasting change in how food labeling and supply chain verification were discussed and regulated across the continent. The scandal became one of the most widely covered food stories in European history, a moment where the distance between what large-scale food production said it was doing and what it was actually doing became impossible to ignore. Lunch Lady Doris had been serving assorted horse parts to Springfield elementary students in 1994. And the joke had been that this was something that happened in institutional food service, that the machinery of mass food production at low cost involves ingredients that nobody with a choice would select. 19 years later, the European food industry confirmed that this was not just a cartoon exaggeration. It was a description of what had been happening at scale in real supply chains across an entire continent. The drum in the episode is the key detail. A drum is not how most people imagine food arriving in a kitchen, even an institutional kitchen. Most people, when they think about food preparation in schools or cafeterias, imagine something more recognizable. The drum is the show's way of signaling that the food has been processed far enough from its original form that it no longer arrives in a shape that communicates what it started as. Something goes into the drum at one end of a supply chain, something comes out at the other end. What happens in between is not visible and is not intended to be visible. That is also the structure of how the horse meat scandal worked. The meat did not arrive at the supermarket labeled as horse. It traveled through a chain of suppliers and processors and distributors, and at each step the paperwork said something different from what was actually in the containers. The distance between the origin of the meat and the consumer who eventually bought a frozen lasagna was long enough and involved enough separate companies in enough separate countries that the substitution was able to travel across Europe without being detected for an extended period. The Simpsons joke and the real scandal share the same underlying logic. In both cases, the food system is operating on the assumption that nobody will look too closely. In both cases, the gap between the label and the contents is significant enough to be disturbing when examined, but small enough in the ordinary functioning of the system to remain unexamined. The drum labeled assorted horse parts is funny in The Simpsons because it is unusually honest, because real labels do not say this even when the contents might justify it. The scandal revealed that real labels had been saying beef when the contents did not justify it. The cartoon had labeled the product honestly in the context of a joke about institutional dishonesty. The real world had labeled the product dishonestly in the context of actual institutional dishonesty. The Simpsons version of the food system and the real version of the food system were doing the same thing, dressed differently. Lunch Lady Doris as a character embodies a specific kind of institutional resignation. She is not actively malicious. She is not conspiring to harm the children. She is a person who has been inside a system long enough that the system's logic has become her logic. The job is to serve the food. The food comes from the drum. What is in the drum is not her department. That quality, not individual malice, but systemic indifference to what is actually happening, is also the quality that allowed horse meat to travel across 14 countries without being caught. Nobody along the supply chain was necessarily trying to harm consumers. The system had developed incentives and gaps that made the substitution possible and the detection unlikely. And the system continued because nobody at any point along the chain had sufficient reason to look closely. There is a second food-related detail from The Simpsons that sits close to this case and is worth noting briefly. In another episode, Lunch Lady Doris is seen using gym mats as a meat substitute, pulling material from a stack of exercise equipment and incorporating it into the school's food. This detail became relevant years later when it emerged that a chemical called azodicarbonamide, which is used in the production of foam rubber and exercise mats, was being used by Subway to keep the bread in its sandwiches springy. The chemical was legal as a food additive in the United States, though it was banned for food use in Europe and Australia. The story generated significant coverage in 2014, and Subway subsequently announced it would remove the ingredient from its bread. The gym mat detail in The Simpsons was not a prediction of the Subway story specifically. The chemical and the actual gym mat are different things. But the image of school cafeteria food being materially connected to gym mats turned out to have more basis in reality than the joke required. The horse meat case, though, is the primary prediction here, and what makes it stick is its specificity. The drum labeled assorted horse parts is not a general joke about food quality. It is a very specific claim about a very specific ingredient being present in food that would not normally be identified as containing it. The scandal confirmed that specific claim, not as a cartoon exaggeration of what might theoretically happen at the lowest end of industrial food production, but as a documented description of what had actually been happening in mainstream food products sold in major supermarkets to ordinary consumers who had no idea. The 19-year gap between the episode and the scandal is the longest confirmed gap in this collection so far. Something that appeared on screen in April 1994 as a background joke in a school cafeteria scene was validated in January 2013 as an accurate description of a real and widespread failure in the European food supply chain. The Simpsons writers could not have known in 1994 that this specific failure would emerge at this specific scale in this specific industry. The joke drew on a general understanding of how institutional food service works, the corners it cuts, the ingredients it uses, the distance it maintains between the consumer and the origin of what is being consumed. That general understanding turned out to be accurate in a very specific way. Lunch Lady Doris kept serving. The children kept eating. The drum kept getting refilled. The system kept running because systems keep running as long as nobody looks at what is in the drum. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case begins underwater and involves a fish with 3 eyes, a nuclear power plant, and the moment in 2011 when a group of fishermen in Argentina pulled something out of a reservoir that made the world briefly stop and remember a cartoon from 1990. Section 8. The Fish with 3 Eyes. Blinky did not ask to be famous. The fish appears near the beginning of 2 cars in every garage and 3 eyes on every fish, the 4th episode of Season 2, which aired on November 1st, 1990. Bart is fishing in the river near the Springfield nuclear power plant when he pulls something unexpected out of the water. The fish is small. It is otherwise unremarkable, except that where a normal fish has 2 eyes, this one has 3. A 3rd eye positioned squarely in the center of its forehead, sitting between the other 2 in a way that is immediately and obviously wrong. The fish becomes a local sensation overnight. A television crew comes to Springfield. Bart is interviewed. The story spreads because a 3-eyed fish caught in the water downstream from a nuclear power plant is exactly the kind of story that spreads. It is visual. It is simple. It is a story about something that should not exist, existing, and it points directly at a corporation with the resources and the incentive to make the story go away. Mr. Burns, who owns the nuclear plant, has a problem. He is running for governor of Springfield. The timing is terrible. A mutant fish caught in water his plant has been using and discharging is not the image a political campaign needs at its most visible moment. He hires a team of scientists to argue that Blinky is not evidence of environmental damage, that the 3rd eye is a natural development, possibly even a sign of evolution, and that the fish is not only harmless, but potentially represents an advance in the species. The episode is about the gap between what powerful people say and what is actually happening. Burns attempts to manage the story through the same tools that corporations in the real world use to manage inconvenient scientific findings: reframing, expert testimony, the language of uncertainty applied to things that are not actually uncertain. The scientists he hires deliver their conclusions. The press conference produces its talking points. The campaign continues. It falls apart at a dinner table. Marge, who has been hosting a campaign dinner at the Simpson house and has been asked to serve the fish as a show of confidence in the plant's safety record, places Blinky in front of Mr. Burns as the main course. The optics require Burns to eat the fish. He cuts into it. He lifts a piece to his mouth. He cannot do it. He spits it out. The cameras capture everything. The campaign collapses. The scene works because the moment of physical honesty, the body refusing to cooperate with the political performance, cuts through everything the Burns machine had constructed around the fish. All the expert testimony and reframing dissolves the moment the man who had been arguing the fish was safe refuses to put it in his mouth in front of witnesses. Blinky became one of the most recognized images in Simpsons history. The three-eyed fish appeared in merchandise, in cultural references, in discussions about nuclear power and environmental accountability. It was a visual shorthand, an image that communicated something specific about the relationship between industrial operations and the environments around them, simple enough to land immediately and pointed enough to carry actual meaning. In November 2011, 21 years after the episode aired, a group of fishermen in the province of Cordoba in Argentina pulled a fish out of a reservoir. The fish was a wolffish, a species called Oligosarcus janinzii, a predatory freshwater fish native to South American river systems. The reservoir the fishermen were working in was fed by water that passed through the cooling systems of the Embalse nuclear power plant, which sits approximately 35 kilometers from the city of Cordoba and had been operating since 1983. The fish had 3 eyes. The third eye was positioned on top of the fish's head rather than between the existing 2, which made the physical configuration slightly different from Blinky's central third eye. But the fundamental fact was the same: a fish caught downstream from a nuclear power plant with an additional eye that should not have been there. The fisherman photographed it. The photograph spread. Within hours, the images were being published alongside screenshots from the Simpsons episode, and the connection between a cartoon fish from 1990 and a real fish from 2011 was being discussed in news outlets across the world. The story generated coverage in Argentina, across South America, in Europe, and in the United States. It generated coverage not only because a three-eyed fish was genuinely unusual and disturbing, but because the Simpsons connection made it a story with a cultural dimension that a straightforward environmental report would not have had on its own. The cartoon image and the photograph existed in the same conversation, and that conversation was about whether the world had arrived at something a television comedy had described 21 years earlier. Scientists who were asked to comment on the Argentine fish were careful in their assessment. A mutation producing an additional eye in a fish is a documented phenomenon. It can result from genetic abnormalities, from exposure to certain chemicals, or from other environmental factors. The proximity of the fish to a nuclear plant did not automatically mean the plant caused the mutation. Nuclear power plants discharge water, and the water that passes through cooling systems is regulated and monitored. But the relationship between that water and the development of mutations in nearby wildlife is a complex scientific question that cannot be resolved by the discovery of a single specimen. The Embalse plant's operators did not issue detailed public statements about the fish. The story moved quickly through media cycles and then receded, as these stories tend to do. No formal scientific study of the specific fish and its relationship to the plant's operations was widely published. The fish was photographed, discussed, connected to the cartoon, and then the news moved on. What the Argentine case confirmed was the visual. The thing that The Simpsons had placed in the world in 1990 had appeared in reality in 2011. Whether the causes were the same, whether the nuclear plant was responsible for the mutation, whether the cartoon's implicit argument about the environmental consequences of nuclear operations was validated by the real fish, those are more complicated questions. The fish existed. The plant was nearby. The image matched the cartoon. That was enough for the story to travel as far as it did. The episode's argument, taken as a whole, is not really about the fish. Blinky is the evidence. The episode is about what happens to evidence when it threatens powerful people, how it gets reframed and managed and professionally argued away by people whose job is to make inconvenient facts seem less definitive. Mr. Burns does not deny that the fish has 3 eyes. He cannot deny it. The fish is there. The eye is there. The camera has recorded it. What he does instead is contest the meaning of the evidence. He hires scientists to provide alternative interpretations. He controls the press access. He argues that what looks like damage might be evolution, that what looks like a symptom might be a feature. This is a more sophisticated satirical target than simply saying nuclear plants are bad. The episode is describing a communications strategy, the specific way that institutions with resources respond to evidence that threatens them. Not denial of the evidence itself, but management of its interpretation. The fish is real. What the fish means is where the argument lives. That strategy, acknowledging evidence while contesting its significance, is a recognizable feature of how corporations and governments handle environmental findings in the real world. The episode was describing it in 1990, in a story about a cartoon fish, with enough clarity that the satire holds up decades later. The dinner scene at the end is the episode's most precise moment. Burns cannot eat the fish. The body understands something that the press conference tried to argue away. The physical refusal is not a choice Burns makes. It is a refusal that happens to him, that overrides the performance he has been constructing around the fish for the entire episode. The spitting out is involuntary. The cameras catch it. The argument he has been making collapses not because anyone produced a better argument against it, but because the person making the argument could not maintain it in the one test that mattered. The real-world equivalent of that moment is the gap between what food safety authorities were told about supply chains in Europe before 2013 and what testing eventually found inside the products. The moment of physical testing, the actual analysis of what was in the food, performed the same function that Marge's dinner party performed in the episode. All the documentation and labeling and official certification had said one thing. The contents said another. The gap between the official story and the reality was only closed when someone actually looked at what was inside. The 3-eyed fish in Argentina was also a moment of testing. A piece of physical reality that did not align with the official picture of what the environment around a nuclear plant looks like. Whether or not the plant caused the mutation, the fish was there. It had been pulled out of a reservoir connected to the plant's water system. Its existence complicated the official picture in the same way Blinky complicated Mr. Burns's campaign. Not necessarily by proving a specific claim, but by making the absence of investigation feel less acceptable. Blinky has appeared in Simpsons merchandise and references for 35 years. The character is simple enough to be immediately recognizable and specific enough to point at something real. A cartoon fish with 3 eyes pulled from water near a nuclear plant is not an abstract environmental statement. It is a concrete image that places a specific consequence in a specific location and gives it a name and a face. That concreteness is what allowed the image to travel so far from a 1990 episode and land so clearly next to a 2011 photograph from Argentina. The episode ends with Burns losing the election. His campaign could not survive Blinky. The fish that his scientists had argued was harmless, possibly even healthy, ended the political ambitions of the man whose plant had produced it. In the story, evidence wins, not because the arguments against it were disproven, but because the evidence was physical and visible and could not ultimately be made to disappear. 21 years after the episode aired, a group of Argentine fishermen pulled something out of the water that the world immediately recognized. Not because they had seen the scientific literature on aquatic mutations near nuclear facilities, because they had seen The Simpsons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is the one where the show did not predict an event or a scandal or a discovery. The next case is where the show predicted a sporting result, named the specific opponent, got the winner right, and did so 8 years before the competition took place, in a sport that the United States had almost never succeeded in at the highest level. Section 9. Stones, Brooms, and Sweden. Nobody expected the United States to win gold in curling. That needs to be said plainly before anything else, because the degree to which the prediction in this case is remarkable depends entirely on understanding how unlikely the result was. The United States men's curling team going into the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, was not a team that analysts or fans, or even curling's most dedicated followers, were placing at the top of their expectations. Curling at the Olympic level is dominated by countries where the sport has deep roots and decades of competitive infrastructure. Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, Scotland. The United States had won a single Olympic curling medal before 2018, a bronze at the 2006 Games in Turin. Gold was not in the realistic conversation. What happened in Pyeongchang on February 24, 2018, was an upset in the full sense of the word. The American team, led by skip John Schuster, defeated Sweden in the gold medal match by a score of 10-7. Sweden had been one of the favorites. The United States had barely qualified for the medal round. The margin of victory was comfortable in the final, but the path to get there had been anything but. The American team lost several of their early round-robin matches and had to string together a run of wins to even reach the knockout stages. When the gold medal was confirmed, people who followed The Simpsons noticed something. Boy Meets Curl is the 12th episode of Season 21, which aired on February 14, 2010. Valentine's Day, 8 years before the Pyeongchang result. The episode opens with Homer and Marge looking for something to do together after walking out of a movie. They find an ice rink, but cannot rent skates because it is curling night. They try curling. They discover, somewhat implausibly, but in the way that The Simpsons treats all of Homer's unexpected competencies, that they are good at it. Marge, in particular, whose years of experience sweeping floors at home have given her an unusually refined technique with a curling broom. The episode was written by Rob Lezebnik, who chose curling over the original concept of four-man bobsled because curling allowed the story to center on both Homer and Marge equally. The writers, wanting the depiction of curling to be accurate enough to hold up, visited a curling club and tried the sport themselves. They also consulted with four-time American mixed curling champions Brady and Kristen Clark, and with Rick Patsky, the chief operating officer of the United States Curling Association. The research investment in the episode was genuine. This was not a casual sports backdrop, but a deliberate attempt to represent the sport accurately within the absurdity of the broader premise. Homer and Marge, joined by Agnes and Seymour Skinner, form a mixed doubles team that qualifies for the United States curling trials. They advance. They make it to the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. The competition is framed as a demonstration sport in the episode. Mixed doubles curling was not an official Olympic event in 2010, and the writers included an explanation within the episode that it was being held as a demonstration event, which was an accurate acknowledgement of the sport's status at that point. Mixed doubles curling would not become a full Olympic event until 2018, the same games where the men's team won gold. The episode builds to a gold medal match against Sweden. Marge injures her shoulder during the semifinals. She is told she will never curl again. The American team appears to be finished. Agnes, who had been skeptical of Homer from the beginning, pushes for him to be cut. Marge refuses, and in the gold medal match, it is revealed that Marge has been curling right-handed her whole life despite being left-handed, and returning to her natural side gives her the ability she needs. The United States wins. Sweden takes silver. Russia finishes third. In the real 2018 Winter Olympics, the United States defeated Sweden in the gold medal match. Sweden won silver. Switzerland won bronze. The episode had Russia in third, which was the one detail that did not match. But the gold medalist and the silver medalist were exactly as the episode had shown them 8 years earlier. Al Jean, the show's longtime executive producer, responded on social media the day of the real result. He posted an image from the medal ceremony depicted in the 2010 episode and congratulated the American team. The episode's writer, Rob Lezebnik, also took to social media to note that the Americans were not actually the first United States team to beat Sweden in Olympic curling. Homer and Marge had done it in 2010 in the episode he had written. The prediction became one of the most widely shared Simpsons cases of 2018 because of its specificity. The United States winning Olympic gold in curling was already a major upset. The United States winning Olympic gold in curling by defeating Sweden was a specific result. The Simpsons having depicted exactly that result, United States gold, Sweden silver, 8 years earlier was the combination that made the case feel genuinely strange rather than coincidental. Curling is not a sport with obvious narrative logic that makes certain outcomes more predictable than others. Golf has dominant players who win repeatedly and whose victories can be anticipated. Tennis has rankings and seedings that make finals matchups somewhat foreseeable. Curling at the Olympic level by 2018 had enough competitive spread among nations that predicting the specific gold and silver medalists 8 years in advance had no obvious rational basis. The writers of Boy Meets Curl chose Sweden as the opponent in the gold medal match because Sweden was a strong curling nation, a logical choice for a fictional final, and because having Homer and Marge beat a credible opponent was more satisfying than having them beat a fictional one. Sweden was the kind of team the United States might plausibly face in an Olympic final, even if that final seemed unlikely. 8 years later, the United States faced Sweden in an Olympic final, and the result matched the cartoon. The episode has layers beyond the prediction that are worth understanding. Boy Meets Curl is at its core a Valentine's Day episode. It aired on February 14th deliberately, and the curling story is built around Homer and Marge finding something they are good at together. The sport becomes a vehicle for the relationship, which is the Simpsons' consistent approach to Homer and Marge across the show's run. Whatever external adventure the episode places them in, the internal story is about two people who work as a pair in ways that other people do not always expect. Homer pushes too hard. Marge compensates. The result is a team that functions because each person covers the gap that the other leaves. The gold medal match is won not through Homer becoming a better athlete,
but through Marge finding a resource she had not been using.
The shoulder injury forces the discovery. She had been curling with her non-dominant side for her entire life without realizing it, which is the kind of detail that only makes sense in a cartoon but communicates something true about the episode's theme. That the things people are actually capable of are sometimes obscured by habits that have never been examined. That structure, an obstacle that forces the discovery of something that was always available but never accessed, is also a reasonable description of what happened to American curling in the years between 2010 and 2018. The sport grew in the United States across that period. More Americans were playing competitively. The infrastructure of the game developed. John Schuster's team, which had performed disappointingly in earlier Olympics, rebuilt and improved to the point where they arrived in Pyeongchang as underdogs who happened to be carrying 8 years of accumulated development in a sport that the country had been quietly taking more seriously. The episode predicted the result. The history of American curling across those 8 years explained how the result became possible. The Simpsons named the endpoint without knowing the path. The path existed independently. They converged in Pyeongchang in February 2018 at exactly the point the cartoon had described. John Schuster himself had a history that made the 2018 gold feel earned in a way that went beyond the result alone. He had competed in 3 previous Winter Olympics: Turin in 2006, Vancouver in 2010, and Sochi in 2014. His team had finished 8th in Vancouver and last in Sochi. The failures had been public and discussed, and Schuster had faced real scrutiny about whether he could perform at the level the Olympics required. The 2018 Games arrived with expectations accordingly low. What happened instead was one of the more remarkable runs in American Olympic history. After losing multiple matches in the round-robin stage, Schuster's team won every elimination match. They defeated Canada, the dominant curling nation in North America, in the semifinals. They walked into the gold medal match against Sweden, having already beaten every team that should have beaten them. The underdog story had a real shape to it by the time they faced Sweden in the final, and the 10-7 victory was comprehensive enough to feel definitive rather than lucky. The Simpsons episode, in writing the United States to a gold medal, had not constructed the path. The episode had simply put the result on screen and attached it to a story about Homer and Marge. The real path was built over 8 years by athletes who had no connection to the cartoon. The destination was the same. Curling as a sport has particular qualities that make it suitable for a Simpsons episode in ways that most Olympic sports are not. The physical demands of curling, while real, are not the kind that immediately register as athletic to a casual observer. The sport involves strategy, reading the ice, calculating angles, deciding when to sweep and how hard, in ways that reward attention and planning over pure physical power. Homer, who is not physically impressive in any measurable way, can be placed in a curling episode without straining the audience's ability to accept the premise. The show would not put Homer in a sprint final or a gymnastics competition. Curling is the Olympic sport where Homer's presence on the team at the gold medal stage feels, just barely, within the range of the absurd that the show can sustain. That quality, the sport's particular accessibility, also explains some of why the Simpsons gold medal prediction landed so hard in 2018. Curling had become one of the most watched events of those games precisely because of the American team's run. People who had never followed curling before were watching Schuster and his teammates progress through the bracket. The sport, which exists at the margins of American sporting culture,
briefly became central to the conversation during those Pyeongchang Games.
The Simpsons had placed that sport at the center of an episode 8 years earlier, had built a Valentine's Day love story around it, had consulted with actual curling officials and champions to get the details right, and had ended the story with the United States on top of the podium after defeating Sweden. When the real version played out in South Korea, the episode existed as a kind of pre-written account of something that had not yet happened, a document the show had placed in 2010 that the world of 2018 validated completely in the parts that mattered. Lezebnik, in his post-match social media response, was characteristically measured. He acknowledged the prediction with humor and congratulated the real team genuinely. He did not claim that the episode had somehow caused the result, or that the writers had possessed any actual knowledge of what American curling would accomplish 8 years later. The episode had been built around what was plausible and what served the story, and plausibility had turned out to be accurate. The bronze medal discrepancy, Russia in the cartoon, Switzerland in reality, is also worth acknowledging directly rather than smoothing over. 2 of the 3 medalists matched exactly. The third did not. This matters because it shows what the Simpsons predictions actually are at their best. Highly specific, educated guesses built on real information that are more accurate than random chance, but are not infallible. Russia was a strong curling nation in 2010. Putting them in third in a fictional Olympic result was as reasonable as putting Sweden in second. Switzerland, which actually won bronze, was also a strong curling nation. Both were credible. The episode picked one. Reality picked the other. The gold and silver match exactly. The bronze does not. The prediction is not magic. The 2 matching positions are the result of the writers choosing realistically and getting lucky in the specific way that realistic choices sometimes produce lucky results. The one non-matching position is the result of the same process producing a different outcome. The episode is not psychic. The episode was careful and happened to be right about the 2 results that mattered most. Agnes Skinner's presence on the fictional American curling team adds a layer to the episode that gets overlooked in the prediction conversation. Agnes is one of the show's most consistently difficult characters. Sharp-tongued, dismissive, convinced that most people around her are failing to meet a standard she has never clearly defined. Her relationship with Seymour is the show's most sustained portrait of a parent whose presence in a child's life has calcified into something damaging. Placing her on an Olympic curling team alongside Homer is one of the episode's broadest comic premises. But Agnes had athletic history in the episode's own logic. She mentions that a fetal kick from an unborn Seymour had disrupted her chances at winning gold in the pole vault at the 1952 Summer Olympics in Helsinki. A throwaway biographical detail that the show uses to establish that Agnes's competitive drive has real roots. The detail is absurd. It is also entirely consistent with the show's approach to its supporting characters, giving them specific, strange histories that make the world of Springfield feel layered and inhabited, even when those histories have no bearing on the main story. Al Jean was the executive producer who posted the medal ceremony image on the day of the real result. He also noted that the show had predicted good things as well as strange ones, that among the cases where The Simpsons appeared to have seen the future, the curling gold was one of the few where the thing predicted was straightforwardly positive. A United States gold medal in an unlikely sport is not a scandal or a corporate merger or the confirmation of institutional corruption. It is an upset by an underdog team in a discipline nobody expected them to master. The Simpsons wrote that upset in 2010 as the climax of a Valentine's Day episode about a married couple finding something to do together. The real upset happened 8 years later because a team of athletes spent 8 years working towards something the country had never achieved before. Both versions end with the United States on the top step of the podium, Sweden in silver, a crowd watching something they did not fully expect to see. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next and final case in this collection is different from every other case that has come before it. The prediction is not about a political figure, or a corporate deal, or a sporting result, or a scientific prize. The final case is about a joke that landed as absurdity in 1994 and became the daily experience of hundreds of millions of people. A joke about a machine that confidently produces the wrong answer and keeps going anyway, and what it means that the Simpsons described that experience 13 years before the world was ready to have it universally. Section 10. Eat Up, Martha. The Apple Newton was a real product. That fact matters more for this case than for any other in this collection. And it matters because it changes what kind of prediction this actually is. Every other case in this essay involves the Simpsons describing something that did not exist yet, a merger that had not happened, a prize that had not been awarded, a tournament result that had not been decided. This case involves the Simpsons describing something that already existed and was already failing, in a way that turned out to describe a problem that would eventually affect nearly every person on the planet. The distinction is worth holding carefully, because the autocorrect case is the most misrepresented prediction in the entire canon of Simpsons predictions coverage. Most articles treat it as a straightforward example of the show seeing the future, a joke from 1994 that predicted the iPhone autocorrect frustrations that became a cultural phenomenon from 2007 onward. The actual story is more complicated, and once understood properly, more interesting than the simplified version. Lisa on Ice is the 8th episode of Season 6, which aired on November 13, 1994. The main story follows Lisa and Bart on opposing youth hockey teams, building toward a match that forces them to choose between winning and their relationship as siblings. The episode is among the strongest of Season 6, tight, emotionally precise, with the specific quality that the best Simpsons episodes share of being genuinely funny and genuinely moving in the same 30 minutes without either quality undermining the other. The Newton scene happens at a Springfield Elementary assembly. It is a brief moment, not connected to the hockey story, not part of the episode's emotional through line. Kearney, one of the school's older bullies, turns to Dolph and tells him to make a note to beat up Martin. Dolph pulls out a Newton, Apple's personal digital assistant, a device that had been released in 1993 and was being marketed as a revolutionary way to take notes and organize information using handwriting recognition. The Newton was supposed to read handwriting and convert it into typed text. Dolph writes the message on the Newton screen. The Newton translates it as, "Eat up, Martha." Dolph stares at what the machine has produced. The moment passes. The scene moves on. The joke required no explanation in 1994 because the Newton's handwriting recognition problems were already widely known and widely mocked. The device had been on the market for a year and had developed a reputation for converting handwritten input into something that bore only a loose relationship to what the user had actually written. Technology journalists had written about the problem. Comedians had made jokes about it. The Newton's failures at the one thing it was specifically designed to do had become a running cultural reference point in the early months after its release. Putting a Newton in the hands of a Springfield Elementary bully and having it produce a nonsensical translation was a joke that the audience in 1994 would have recognized immediately. They had either used the device, seen demonstrations of it, or read about its limitations. Apple discontinued the Newton in 1998. The product had never fully recovered from the reputation it developed in those first years, and the company eventually abandoned the entire category. For nearly a decade after the Newton's discontinuation, handwriting recognition on portable devices remained a niche concern. The mainstream audience had moved on. Then the iPhone arrived in 2007. The iPhone did not use handwriting recognition. It used a touchscreen keyboard, which meant users were tapping letters on a glass surface rather than writing them out. Apple built an autocorrect system into the keyboard, software designed to catch spelling errors, guess at intended words, and automatically replace what the user typed with what the system calculated they probably meant. The system worked well enough that it became standard. Every major smartphone adopted some version of the same approach. The autocorrect failures began almost immediately. The software's corrections were often correct, but the cases where they were wrong produced a specific kind of error, the phone replacing what the user actually typed with something that was either embarrassing, confusing, or completely unrelated to the intended message. The corrections happened automatically, without asking for confirmation. The message would send before the user noticed what had been changed. The recipient would receive something that made no sense, or made sense in a way the sender had not intended. By 2010, autocorrect failures had become one of the most widely shared categories of content on the internet. Dedicated websites collected the most egregious examples, conversations where the phone's corrections had produced messages that ranged from mildly confusing to spectacularly wrong. The shared experience of sending or receiving an autocorrected message that said something unintended was familiar enough that it became a standard reference point in conversations about technology and its relationship with human intention. Dulce Newton translating Beat Up Martin into Eat Up Martha in 1994 is structurally identical to every autocorrect failure that became a cultural phenomenon from 2007 onward. A person types a clear instruction. The machine reads it. The machine produces a confident translation that is wrong in a specific way. Not random noise, but something that has a relationship to the input without being accurate to it. The machine does not flag the error. The machine does not ask for confirmation. The machine produces its incorrect output and moves on, leaving the human to deal with the gap between intention and result. The Newton and the iPhone autocorrect system are not the same technology. The Newton used handwriting recognition. It was trying to read physical marks made on a screen and convert them to text. The iPhone autocorrect was working from text that had already been typed, making predictions about what word the user intended based on what keys they had pressed. The mechanism is different, the failure mode is the same. In both cases, a machine confidently produces the wrong answer and presents it as if it were correct. This is the version of the prediction story that gets lost in most coverage. The Simpsons in 1994 was not predicting iPhone autocorrect. The Simpsons in 1994 was mocking a real device that was already doing something that would eventually become universal. The joke was about the Newton specifically. The reason the joke resonates so clearly when placed next to iPhone autocorrect is that both involve the same underlying problem. Technology that processes human input and produces output that the human did not intend, presented with full confidence and no acknowledgement of error. What The Simpsons predicted was not a specific product. The show predicted that this failure mode, the confident machine that gets it wrong, would remain a feature of the relationship between humans and their devices. The Newton failed at this in 1994 and became a cultural joke for exactly that reason. The show made the joke. The Newton disappeared. And then, 13 years later, the same failure mode arrived inside a device that reached hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And the joke stopped being about a failed Apple product and became about an experience that most people alive could recognize from their own phones. The scale change is the prediction, not the technology, not the specific mechanism. The Simpsons joke in 1994 was about a niche device used by early technology adopters. The real-world version of the same joke arrived in a form that was universal, something that happened to almost everyone, that everyone had a story about, that websites dedicated themselves to collecting examples of. The Simpsons placed the failure mode in the world at a moment when it was visible only to a small number of people, and the world eventually scaled it to a size where nobody was exempt from it. There is something worth sitting with in the image of Dolph staring at the Newton's output. Beat up Martin was a clear instruction, simple words, clear meaning, no ambiguity. The Newton produced Eat Up Martha, which shares almost nothing with the original message beyond a vague phonetic resemblance. Dolph's stare contains the specific quality of human frustration that emerges when a machine produces confident nonsense, the recognition that the tool has failed at the precise moment it was supposed to be useful, without acknowledging the failure, without offering a correction, without any indication that it understands the gap between what was asked and what was delivered. That stare became universal by 2010. Every person who sent an auto-corrected message that said something unintended had a version of that moment, the split second between reading what the phone had produced and registering that the phone had replaced their words with something wrong. The frustration Dolph directed at a 1993 Apple product in a cartoon became the daily experience of smartphone users across the world for years afterward. What makes this case particularly interesting when placed alongside the others in this collection is the direction of the prediction. The Trump case involved the show looking at a political culture and identifying where it was heading. The Disney-Fox case involved the show looking at a corporate landscape and naming its likely endpoint. The Holmstrom case involved the show researching the academic world and identifying who was doing work significant enough to eventually be recognized at the highest level. The Newton case involved the show looking at a technology that was already in the world, already failing in a specific way, and essentially saying that this failure, a machine misunderstanding human instruction and producing confident nonsense, was going to matter. Not just as a joke about one product, but as a description of something fundamental about the relationship between people and the machines they build to help them. The Newton failed and disappeared, but the problem it embodied did not disappear. The problem scaled. It moved from handwriting recognition to text prediction, from a device used by thousands to a device used by billions. From a niche annoyance in 1994 to a universal experience by 2012. The Simpsons joke was about the Newton. The prediction was about the problem. Lisa on Ice is remembered as one of the genuinely strong episodes of Season 6, a character piece about the Simpsons siblings that uses a hockey rivalry to get at something true about the relationship between competition and love. The emotional climax of the episode is one of the most discussed moments in the show's history. Lisa and Bart, facing each other across the ice in a sudden death penalty shootout, choosing each other over the game. The moment has been written about and analyzed extensively as an example of the show at its best, specific, earned, quietly devastating in the way only The Simpsons could manage at that period in its run. The Newton scene exists in the same episode as that climax. One moment is about the deepest possible connection between two people who are supposed to be opponents. The other is about the gap between what a machine understands and what a person means. Both are about communication, about the difference between what is intended and what is received, about what happens when that gap closes and what happens when it does not. That connection is probably not deliberate on the writer's part. The Newton gag was built for a quick laugh, not to rhyme thematically with the episode's emotional center. But The Simpsons at its best produced this kind of accidental coherence regularly. Episodes where the throwaway jokes and the serious material were exploring the same territory from different angles without anyone having consciously designed the relationship. The episode moved on from the Newton scene quickly. The emotional weight of the episode lives in the hockey match and what it asks of the two siblings at its center. A moment where competition and love come into direct conflict, and the choice that gets made says something true about who these characters are. The Newton moment is a corridor the episode passes through on its way to something more important. A quick joke designed to land and release without requiring any investment from the audience. That structural casualness is the consistent feature of The Simpsons' predictions that this essay has traced across 10 cases. The Trump line was background dialogue in a story about Bart's future. The Disney Fox sign was a background detail in a story about Homer and celebrities. The Nobel Prize betting sheet was a prop in a scene about children being nerds. The drum labeled Assorted horse parts was a visual in a cafeteria scene about something else entirely. The Newton gag was a corridor moment in an episode about sibling rivalry and hockey. None of these moments were the point of the episode containing them. Every one of them was furniture, part of the texture the writers built around the actual story, the specific details that made the world of Springfield feel real and observed and inhabited by people who were paying attention to the world outside the animation studio. The predictions were never The Simpsons trying to predict. They were The Simpsons trying to be accurate about the world as it was, and the world turning out to be more like the show's version of it than anyone expected. The autocorrect case lands last in this collection, not because it is the most dramatic. The Trump prediction is more famous. The Cypress Hill case has the longest gap. The FIFA episode got 2 predictions right inside 3 months. The Newton case lands last because it is the most honest description of what all 10 cases actually are. Not magic, not time travel, not a writer's room full of people with unusual gifts for seeing the future. A group of people paying careful attention to the world, building that attention into the texture of a television show, filling the corners of frames with real names and real products and real observations about how things work and where they are heading. And then time doing what time does, moving forward, carrying events with it, eventually arriving at the places the show had already been standing. Dolph stared at Eat Up Martha. The Newton did not apologize. The machine had done what it did, and the result was the result. The gap between what was intended and what was produced sat there on the screen, confident and wrong, waiting for someone to figure out what to do with it. 30 years later, that gap is still there. The device is different, the scale is different, the fundamental experience of asking a machine to help with something simple and receiving something that requires human correction has not changed. The Simpsons placed it in the world in 1994, embedded in a bully's attempt to schedule violence against a smaller child, and the world eventually made it universal. 10 cases. 10 moments where a cartoon, built by people who watch the world carefully, placed something in a frame, and the world eventually walked into it. Some took 1 year, some took 28. The distances are different. The consistency of the pattern across those distances is what this essay has been building toward, and what the conclusion is going to try to answer directly. Not how The Simpsons predicted the future, what it means that a television show did it 10 times across 35 years in ways specific enough that the world kept stopping to notice. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.